The most dangerous thing about power is not that it can be taken away. It's that it can slowly make reality disappear. Most people look at King Lear and see a tragedy about a ruler who loses control. But what if that's not the real warning? What if Shakespeare was pointing toward something far more unsettling, something that affects kings, CEOs, politicians, founders, parents, and anyone who sits at the center of a system? What if the crown was never a symbol of power? What if it was a filter? Think about that for a moment. The higher someone rises, the more influence they gain. That sounds like an advantage. But influence changes something else. It changes the flow of truth. People begin editing themselves. Honest disagreement becomes risky. Criticism becomes uncomfortable. Reality starts arriving in carefully packaged forms. And that creates a paradox. The person with the most authority often has the least access to what is actually happening. That paradox sits at the heart of King Lear. Not Lear the historical figure. Not Lear the king. Lear as an idea. Lear represents a role that appears throughout human history, the leader who becomes the center of reality. The person whose decisions shape everyone else's future. The person whose approval carries weight. The person whose presence changes the behavior of everyone in the room. And that is precisely where the danger begins. Because once authority reaches a certain level, people stop responding to who you are. They start responding to what you represent. The crown becomes our first memory fragment. Not a piece of gold. Not a symbol of victory. A barrier. A layer between a leader and the truth. And here is the mystery that Shakespeare seems obsessed with. If everyone around you begins adjusting their behavior because of your power, how would you ever know what is real anymore? The obvious answer is wisdom. But King Lear quietly challenges that assumption. Wisdom is not merely intelligence. It is not experience. It is not status. Wisdom depends on feedback. It depends on hearing things you do not want to hear. It depends on voices that can challenge you without fear. Remove those voices, and something strange begins to happen. A leader can remain powerful while becoming increasingly blind. Not blind in the physical sense. Blind to motives. Blind to loyalty. Blind to consequences. Blind to reality itself. And that blindness carries a cost. Because when truth disappears from a system, it never disappears alone. Trust follows it. Judgment follows it. Stability follows it. Soon, the damage spreads outward. From a person to a family. From a family to an institution. From an institution to an entire kingdom. This is why King Lear continues to feel disturbingly modern centuries after it was written. Shakespeare was not simply asking whether a ruler could lose authority. He was asking something far more profound. What happens when authority itself becomes the reason a leader can no longer see clearly? That question leads us to another symbol that will follow us throughout this journey. The storm. Not the storm outside. The storm that forms when reality has been ignored for too long. And the unsettling possibility that by the time a leader finally sees the truth, the consequences may already be moving faster than wisdom can catch them. But if authority acts like a filter, then a deeper question emerges. What exactly gets filtered out? The obvious answer would be criticism. Yet Shakespeare seems to be pointing toward something more fundamental than disagreement. The first thing power removes is not opposition. It is uncertainty. And that sounds like a good thing until you think about it. Most of us spend our lives trying to eliminate uncertainty. We want confidence. We want clarity. We want people who reassure us that we're making the right decisions. But what if uncertainty serves a hidden purpose? What if doubt is not a weakness in leadership, but one of its last remaining connections to reality? This is where the central conflict begins to reveal itself. King Lear is often remembered as a ruler. But from the perspective of this story's deeper architecture, Lear functions as something else, a human being whose position has become larger than his ability to question himself. That distinction matters. Because the moment a role becomes more important than self-awareness, a dangerous transformation begins. Authority stops being something you possess. It becomes something that possesses you. The crown, our first memory fragment, changes meaning again. Earlier, it appeared as a barrier between a leader and reality. Now it becomes something even more troubling. A machine that rewards certainty. A machine that quietly punishes self-doubt. And over time, that machine produces a strange illusion. The more agreement a leader receives, the more confidence they gain. The more confidence they gain, the less likely they are to question the information reaching them. The less they question, the narrower reality becomes. It is a loop. A loop that feels like strength while functioning as blindness. And this is where another memory fragment enters the story. The fool. Not merely a character. A symbol. A reminder that truth often survives in forms authority can tolerate. Think about the contradiction hidden inside that idea. The most honest voice in a system is rarely the most powerful one. In fact, truth often migrates toward the margins. It appears in humor, in irony, in uncomfortable observations, in people who possess little status but see patterns others ignore. Why? Because power influences speech. Reality does not. And that creates one of the most important revelations in the entire tragedy. The greatest threat to leadership is not rebellion. It is insulation. Not enemies. Distance. Not conflict. Silence. A kingdom can survive disagreement. Organizations survive disagreement. Families survive disagreement. What they struggle to survive is an environment where honesty becomes increasingly expensive. Notice how the scale is already expanding. This is no longer just about a ruler sitting on a throne. It's about executive boardrooms where nobody challenges the CEO. It's about political circles where loyalty matters more than truth. It's about families where difficult conversations are postponed until relationships quietly fracture. The pattern remains the same. Reality sends warnings. The system learns to ignore them. And eventually those ignored truths accumulate like storm clouds beyond the horizon. Which brings us to our next memory fragment. The storm. Not as weather. As consequence. As the physical shape of reality returning after being denied. Because reality has a peculiar characteristic. It can be delayed. It can be disguised. It can be ignored for years. But it cannot be negotiated with forever. And that raises an unsettling possibility. If Lear's real problem was never arrogance alone, but the gradual loss of meaningful contact with reality, then where does that process actually begin? Does authority create blindness? Or does it merely reveal a blindness that was already there, waiting for power to make it visible? If blindness is not created by authority alone, then we arrive at a more uncomfortable question. Why do some people lose contact with reality when they gain power, while others do not? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Pride. Ego. Vanity. Those explanations are familiar because they are easy. But Shakespeare appears to be exploring something much deeper than personal flaws. The real crisis begins when authority stops being a responsibility and becomes an identity. That distinction changes everything. A responsibility can be questioned. An identity must be defended. The moment a leader begins to confuse who they are with the position they hold, every challenge starts to feel personal. Every disagreement feels like disrespect. Every uncomfortable truth feels like an attack. And suddenly the system changes. Not because anyone issued an order. Not because a law was passed. But because people adapt. This is one of the most important contradictions in the entire story. Authority does not need to silence truth directly. Often, truth silences itself. People learn what is rewarded. People learn what is safe. People learn which conversations create approval and which create tension. Over time, an invisible culture emerges. A culture where agreement feels valuable and honesty feels dangerous. That is where the crisis truly begins. Because the greatest threat to a leader is not deception from enemies. It is distortion from allies. Think about how strange that is. The individuals closest to power are usually expected to provide the clearest information. Yet proximity to authority often creates incentives to protect comfort instead of reality. This is where another memory fragment becomes important. The empty throne. Not as a symbol of absence. As a symbol of dependency. Most people assume institutions depend on authority. Shakespeare quietly suggests the opposite. Authority depends on truth. Remove enough truth, and even the strongest throne begins standing on illusion. And illusions have a hidden weakness. They require constant maintenance. Reality does not. This creates a fascinating escalation. The more a system depends on appearance, the more energy it spends protecting appearance. The more energy it spends protecting appearance, the less energy remains for understanding reality. Eventually, leaders become surrounded by reflections instead of information. The crown becomes a mirror. The throne becomes a stage. Authority becomes performance. And performance begins replacing judgment. Now the scale expands beyond one ruler. This pattern appears throughout history. Organizations fail after years of apparent success. Political systems collapse despite appearing stable. Entire civilizations become vulnerable while publicly projecting confidence. The same contradiction appears again and again. The warning signs are visible. Yet the people with the greatest power often see them last. Why? Because authority changes the cost of honesty. And when honesty becomes expensive, reality starts disappearing from the center of the system. This is where the figure of Lear becomes more than a character. He becomes a model. A representation of what happens when influence grows faster than self-awareness. The tragedy is not that he lacks intelligence. The tragedy is that intelligence alone cannot compensate for a shrinking connection to reality. That insight carries a consequence far beyond literature. A family can survive mistakes. A company can survive mistakes. A nation can survive mistakes. What they struggle to survive is a leadership structure that can no longer recognize its own mistakes. And that leads us toward an even deeper mystery. Perhaps the most dangerous form of blindness is not failing to see the truth. Perhaps it is believing that you already possess it. Because if certainty is the final product of unchecked authority, then an unsettling possibility emerges. What if the true opposite of wisdom is not ignorance at all? What if the true opposite of wisdom is the conviction that there is nothing left to learn? What if the deepest problem was never authority, certainty, or even blindness? What if all of those were symptoms of something more fundamental? This is where Shakespeare begins revealing a layer that many readers sense but rarely articulate. The central issue is not that a leader stops hearing the truth. It is that a leader gradually loses the ability to recognize where truth comes from. That distinction changes the entire meaning of the story. Most people assume truth arrives through status, expertise, rank, or formal authority. Yet again and again, Shakespeare points in the opposite direction. The voices most closely connected to reality are often the ones least protected by power. The result is a profound inversion. Authority controls the kingdom, but authority does not control truth. In fact, the more a system becomes organized around hierarchy alone, the more likely truth is to emerge from unexpected places. This brings us back to one of the most important memory fragments in the entire project, the fool. Not as an individual, but as a symbol. A symbol of an ancient pattern that appears throughout history. The person who sees clearly is often not the person who governs. The person who understands reality is often not the person making decisions. The person closest to the truth may occupy the lowest position in the hierarchy. At first, this seems irrational. Should wisdom not naturally rise to the top? Shakespeare's revelation suggests otherwise. Systems reward many things. Loyalty, competence, ambition, confidence. But none of those guarantee wisdom. And when a civilization begins confusing confidence with wisdom, a subtle form of instability enters the structure itself. Suddenly, the conflict expands beyond a single ruler. It becomes a question about institutions, organizations, governments, and even cultures. What qualities do systems reward? What qualities do they ignore? What qualities become invisible? The answers determine far more than individual outcomes. They shape collective reality. This is where another memory fragment gains new meaning: blindness. Earlier, blindness appeared as a failure of perception. Now it reveals itself as something larger. Blindness becomes a structural phenomenon. Entire groups can become blind. Entire institutions can become blind. Entire eras can become blind. Not because information is unavailable, but because certain truths become difficult to recognize within the logic of the system itself. This creates one of the most unsettling consequences in the tragedy. Reality does not disappear. It simply relocates. It moves away from official narratives. Away from status. Away from appearances. It waits in the margins until consequences force everyone to confront it. That is why the storm matters so much as a symbol. Not because it creates disorder. Because it reveals disorder that already existed. The storm does not cause the crisis. It exposes it. And that insight carries enormous philosophical weight. Many people believe collapse begins when things fall apart. Shakespeare suggests collapse begins much earlier. Collapse begins when a system loses contact with reality while still appearing successful. By the time visible consequences arrive, the deeper failure has often existed for years. Now the crown transforms once again. First it was a barrier. Then it became a mirror. Now it becomes a test. A test of whether someone can remain connected to truth while occupying a position designed to separate them from it. And that leads us toward a revelation that changes the scale of the entire story. Perhaps the real measure of leadership is not the ability to command. Perhaps it is the ability to remain teachable after gaining the power to stop listening. But if that is true, then an even larger mystery emerges. Why do some individuals become more humble when confronted with reality, while others spend their lives constructing elaborate illusions to avoid it? So why do some people spend their lives constructing illusions instead of confronting reality? The answer may be the deepest revelation hidden within this entire tragedy. The story is not ultimately about authority corrupting judgment. It is about something far more human. The desire to be affirmed. The desire to see ourselves reflected back in a way that feels comforting, meaningful, and secure. This is the point where all the major symbols suddenly connect. The crown. The throne. The storm. The fool. Blindness. They are not separate ideas. They are different expressions of the same underlying conflict. The conflict between reality and identity. Most people assume leaders seek power because they want control. Shakespeare suggests another possibility. Many people seek authority because they want certainty about who they are. Authority appears to answer the question that every human being carries somewhere beneath the surface: am I important? Am I respected? Am I valued? Am I significant? But here is the trap. Reality can never fully satisfy those questions. Only identity can. An identity is always hungry. The more it is fed, the more it demands. This is why the story's deepest contradiction is not political. It is psychological. The greater the need for affirmation becomes, the harder it becomes to tolerate information that threatens that affirmation. Slowly, almost invisibly, truth and self-image begin moving in opposite directions. At first the gap is small. Then it grows. Eventually a person reaches a point where protecting identity feels more important than understanding reality. This is the hidden architecture beneath the tragedy. The central figure becomes more than a ruler. He becomes a symbol of a universal human vulnerability. The vulnerability of preferring a flattering illusion over a difficult truth. And this is where the crown reveals its final meaning. It is not merely a symbol of power. It is a symbol of amplified identity. Everything becomes larger. Praise becomes louder. Recognition becomes greater. Status becomes more visible. Yet the self underneath remains fundamentally unchanged. The same fears remain. The same insecurities remain. The same need for validation remains. Authority does not remove those weaknesses. It magnifies them. That insight changes how we understand the entire conflict. The real danger was never external. The real danger was the inability to separate self-worth from perception. Once those become fused together, reality itself becomes negotiable. Truth becomes conditional. Judgment becomes vulnerable. And every system built around that leader inherits the same distortion. This is why the consequences extend far beyond one individual. Families inherit illusions. Organizations inherit illusions. Governments inherit illusions. Entire societies can inherit illusions. What begins as a private psychological weakness gradually becomes a collective reality. History offers countless examples of this pattern. Not because human beings fail to gather information, but because human beings often struggle to accept information that threatens the stories they tell about themselves. That is the revelation hidden beneath the surface of the tragedy. The greatest threat to wisdom is not ignorance. It is attachment. Attachment to identity. Attachment to certainty. Attachment to being seen a certain way. The storm, then, becomes something profoundly symbolic. It represents the moment reality becomes stronger than illusion. The moment the world stops negotiating with the stories we tell ourselves. And that leaves us with a question whose consequences extend far beyond literature. If entire systems can be shaped by the identities of the people who lead them, then what kind of legacy is created when leaders build their decisions on self-understanding rather than self-protection? And perhaps more importantly, what happens to a civilization when too many people choose comforting illusions over uncomfortable truths? If the deepest danger lies in choosing self-protection over self-understanding, then we have to ask a difficult question. What remains after that choice has run its course? Not just for a leader. Not just for a family. But for an entire system shaped by that way of seeing the world. The answer forms the lasting consequence of the tragedy. The greatest losses are not always visible. Institutions can be rebuilt. Positions can be replaced. Structures can be redesigned. But the hidden damage occurs in something much harder to restore. Trust in reality itself. Once a system becomes organized around preserving identity rather than pursuing truth, everyone inside that system begins adapting to the distortion. People stop asking certain questions. They stop challenging certain assumptions. They stop exploring certain possibilities. Over time, imagination shrinks. Judgment weakens. The range of acceptable thought becomes narrower and narrower. This is why the story's legacy extends far beyond leadership. It is ultimately about the conditions required for wisdom to survive. Wisdom does not emerge automatically from intelligence. It does not emerge automatically from experience. It does not emerge automatically from authority. Wisdom requires an environment where reality can move freely. Where uncomfortable observations can be voiced. Where correction is not treated as disloyalty. Where truth does not need permission from power in order to exist. This brings us back to the strongest memory fragments that have guided the entire journey. The crown. The fool. The storm. The empty throne. Together they form a complete map. The crown represents the temptation to confuse status with understanding. The fool represents reality surviving outside the boundaries of prestige. The storm represents the eventual return of consequences that can no longer be postponed. And the empty throne represents a profound truth that civilizations repeatedly forget: no position, no institution, and no system can remain stable when it becomes disconnected from reality for too long. Notice how the scale continues expanding. What begins as an individual struggle becomes a social pattern. Organizations become vulnerable when image matters more than feedback. Communities become fragile when agreement becomes more valuable than honesty. Entire cultures become unstable when appearance gradually replaces understanding. This pattern appears throughout history not because people lack knowledge, but because people often underestimate the cost of self-deception. And that cost accumulates quietly. Years of distortion can be hidden beneath visible success. Years of avoidance can be disguised as stability. Years of denial can look remarkably similar to confidence. Until reality arrives with a bill that can no longer be ignored. Yet this is not the legacy Shakespeare leaves us with. The lasting legacy is more hopeful than that. The tragedy functions as a warning, but also as a guide. It suggests that wisdom begins at the exact moment certainty loosens its grip. The moment a person becomes willing to see themselves clearly. The moment authority becomes less important than understanding. The moment learning becomes more valuable than being right. In that sense, the central figure becomes more than a cautionary example. He becomes a mirror. Not a mirror for rulers alone, but for anyone whose identity has become attached to a role, a status, a reputation, or an image of who they believe themselves to be. Because the fundamental conflict was never confined to a kingdom. It exists wherever human beings must choose between comfort and reality. And that leaves us with a final paradox before we reach the end of this journey. If wisdom requires remaining open to correction, and authority naturally reduces the likelihood of being corrected, then is the greatest challenge of leadership learning how to hold power? Or is it learning how to remain human while holding it? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after the world that produced it disappeared. Not because it offers answers, but because it exposes a condition that seems permanently woven into human nature. Every generation invents new technologies, new institutions, new systems of influence, and new forms of status. Yet the deeper challenge remains remarkably unchanged. Human beings still struggle to see themselves clearly. We still search for certainty in places where certainty cannot truly be found. We still mistake recognition for understanding, visibility for wisdom, and influence for insight. And somewhere within that struggle, the symbols that have followed us throughout this journey begin to take on a final meaning. The crown is no longer simply connected to leadership. It becomes a symbol for every role, title, achievement, or identity that promises significance. The empty throne becomes a reminder that every position is temporary, no matter how permanent it appears. The fool becomes a symbol of a rare human capacity, the willingness to remain honest when honesty is inconvenient. And the storm becomes something even larger than consequence. It becomes reality itself. Patient. Unemotional. Unconcerned with our preferences. Waiting for us to recognize what was always there. Seen from this perspective, the story is not really about the rise or fall of any particular individual. It is about a question that confronts every person, regardless of status. What happens when the image we have of ourselves begins competing with the truth about ourselves? That conflict exists in boardrooms and classrooms. In governments and families. In public life and private life. It exists whenever people become more committed to defending an identity than exploring reality. And perhaps that is why the work feels so modern. Not because the world has remained the same, but because the human mind has remained recognizable. The temptation has never disappeared. The temptation to surround ourselves with agreement. The temptation to avoid discomfort. The temptation to choose admiration over understanding. Yet hidden within the tragedy is a quieter insight. The capacity for wisdom may not come from accumulating more authority, more knowledge, or more influence. It may begin with something much simpler. The willingness to be corrected. The willingness to encounter reality before reality is forced upon us. The willingness to remain a student of life even when the world has started treating us like an expert. That idea transforms the entire legacy of the story. The most admirable figures are not necessarily the most powerful. They are the ones who remain connected to truth when doing so carries a cost. The ones who can distinguish reality from appearance. The ones who understand that self-knowledge is not a destination but an ongoing discipline. And so the final image is not a throne, a kingdom, or even a leader. It is a human being standing between two possibilities. On one side lies the comfort of illusion. On the other lies the uncertainty of truth. Every life, in its own way, moves between those two forces. Every society does as well. And perhaps the most important question left behind is not whether power changes people, or whether wisdom can survive authority. Perhaps the deeper question is this: if reality is always trying to teach us something about ourselves, how much of our lives is spent listening, and how much is spent protecting the version of ourselves we most want to believe?